In the wake of the conflict in Ukraine and a split from Russia, the European Union appears to have spotted new opportunities in Latin America. That's especially so following the election loss of Brazil's President Jair Bolsonaro. The EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, hinted at a new focus from Europe in a recent visit to Argentina and Uruguay. Most strikingly, there are signs that a long-delayed trade agreement may soon be in for a new lease of life. So, should Latin America welcome a change in heart from the European Union? Or should it be a little bit suspicious of a union which is desperate for new sources of energy? Welcome to the program. I'm Philip Hampshire. The European Union is eyeing up Latin America as a possible new set of allies that would decrease its dependence on Russia and China for energy and raw materials. The election of Lula da Silva in Brazil also opens the door for cooperation on environmental issues that didn't seem to be there under right-wing Bolsonaro. There's new optimism that Europe's proposed trade deal with the Southern Common Market, which is commonly known as Mercosur, could also finally be up for renegotiation. Now, this deal was originally signed back in 2019, but it still hasn't been ratified, mostly over human rights and environmental concerns. Josep Borrell had this to say about the partnership and the future of the agreement.
The war in Ukraine has sent shockwaves around the world in energy and food prices. Latin America can feed more people, it can continue to produce more food and also energy, and we can supply it with technology and capital.
The question is, what would each side get out of closer ties, and would it be a meeting of equals? Joining us to discuss this in Nuremberg, Germany, we have Sandra Zapata, who's postdoctoral researcher at the Friedrich Alexander Universität. In Brussels, we have Miriam Garcia Ferrer, who is the European Union Commission spokesperson for trade and agriculture. And also in Brussels, we have Audrey Shangu, who is the trade campaigner at Friends of the Earth. So if we can start out, Sandra, I'm going to be a little bit cynical here and say a friend in need is a friend indeed. Would that be overly cynical? Why now? Why is the European Union moving closer towards Mercosur at this time?
Well, it is a bit cynical, but I think it is very right, because we should read the renewed presence of the European Union in Latin America in terms of the geopolitical importance it has. There are many factors, for example, that we should be considering, like the increasing rivalry between China and the US. Europe has been losing influence in the region to China. China is now the first commercial partner of countries like Brazil, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, or Argentina. It has already displaced the European Union, and it has surpassed the place of the United States. So the EU presence in Latin America is trying to counterweight the influence of these external actors in Latin America. Now, Europe finds a region which is more open to alternative alliances. 21 countries out of the 33 countries in Latin America have already joined the China's Belt and Road Initiative. Or another thing to mention is the Russia-Ukraine war. This was a wake-up call for the European Union that many Latin American countries do not share the European response launched to the war. Brazil, for example, Cuba, or El Salvador, Nicaragua, Bolivia, they abstained from condemning the invasion of Ukraine.
Well, if I can cross to Miriam. Miriam, you are a spokesperson at the European Union. I realise I was being a little bit glib and perhaps a little bit unfair in saying why now, slightly cynically, but you can understand why people might look at this situation and say, well, hang on a second, why is the European Union reaching out to us right now?
Well, the European Union has been reaching to the region for many years already. We have agreements with many countries in Latin America. We have agreements in place with Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. We have agreements with Central America, with CARIFORUM, and with Chile and Mexico that we are currently also modernizing. With Mercosur, we have also been negotiating for many years. We concluded in 2019, and now we are reaching the final stages. So we believe that is a very important agreement in terms of geostrategic importance, but also economic importance. And we want to engage further with the region. And this is one of the priorities for next year. We will have the EU-CELAC summit taking place in the second semester. And we really want to boost our relationship with the region. It's about sharing values with like-minded partners. It's about engaging further and really trying to counter all the crises we have been facing, starting with the COVID pandemic, of course, but then of course we need to address the digital and the green transition, and we need to work with like-minded partners. And the current situation with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, of course, makes it even more relevant to engage with the region.
Well, if we were to look back, though, on the amount of time that there have been negotiations between Mercosur and the European Union, there are reasons why the European Union has taken so long to ratify an agreement, human rights issues being one of them. So do you think that those hurdles can now be overcome at this time?
Well, we have in the agreement with Mercosur, it has a trade component and has also a political and cooperation component. It's a broader agreement. I'm dealing with the trade part, but of course it has a broader dimension where we also address human rights, we address engagement with civil society, and to really make sure we take into consideration all the concerns. When it relates to trade, we have also a very ambitious trade and sustainable development chapter that we negotiate and we include systematically in all our trade agreements. And here we also have commitments to address possible environmental issues and social issues, labor issues. We relate to the environmental agreements, we relate to the ILO conventions, etc. However, there have been concerns going beyond that in relation to the deforestation.
We'll come back to some of those concerns in just a moment. Let me bring in Audrey at this point. Audrey, what do you think about the timing of this potential deal between Mercosur and the European Union?
So we can definitely see a renewed push for the ratification of the Eu-mercosur trade deal from the European Commission. The Commission has always been in favor of this deal, even before the war in Ukraine, and despite record-breaking levels in the region. And it's now using this geopolitical argument to secure raw materials in the global south, but at the expense of nature and the people there. And just to give you some examples of how damaging this deal is, if ratified, the trade deal will boost the export of raw materials and agricultural products like soy and beef that are drivers of deforestation in important biomes like the Amazon. And these products are also linked to land grabbing and violations of indigenous people's rights. The deal will also increase the exports of dangerous chemicals and pesticides from Europe to the South American countries. And this includes chemicals that are actually banned in Europe because of harm for human health and for the environment. And thirdly, the deal will also increase the exports of fossil fuel cars from Europe to Mercosur countries, which will impact the industries there, but also go along with significant job losses. So overall, this deal is very destructive for the climate. It's not in line with the Paris Agreement and Europe's climate commitments.
Let me put that across to Miriam. Miriam, you've heard Audrey there. Audrey said that she feels that this deal might be very destructive for Mercosur countries, particularly environmentally, and she also raises the human rights issues again.
So let me start by explaining that we have a very strong agreement in terms of sustainable development with a chapter that addresses these concerns, and that can be the best way to make sure that we will not have negative impacts. Then on top of that, it was mentioned, for example, the soya production. Soya is already entering duty-free the European Union, so there is no difference in terms of the agreement. Plus, the agreement goes on top of all the requirements that we have already on sustainability within the European Union and all the autonomous measures that we have enforced or that we are discussing. We, for example, presented proposals to address deforestation. We have also proposals to make sure that there is due diligence in the supply chain so that the companies that are importing into the European Union are making sure that the whole value chain is respecting certain principles. We also recently issued a proposal on forced labor to also remove forced labor from the internal market. So we have the agreement, but we have in parallel a whole range of autonomous measures to address such concerns. And then on top of that, we are now addressing the concerns on sustainability that have been raised by many stakeholders. We have listened to them. We have listened also to the member states that were worried about the potential impacts that this agreement would have. And we are producing and preparing an additional instrument where we would address these concerns. This would be a reciprocal instrument that we would need to agree with the Mercosur countries before it would be finalized.
Let's talk about those instruments in just a second, because I'd like to drag Sandra in here. Sandra, what are your feelings on this?
Well, I think there are important issues to consider in this renewed cooperation between Europe and Latin America, but I think Latin America is always better off consolidating a strategic partnership with Europe because both blocs share similar values, history, culture. There are economic ties, very solid economic ties, than being partners with some other regions that may not share the same values. I think, for example, there are in the energy sector a lot of things to do between the European Union and Latin America. Latin America now is a world power in terms of biodiversity, renewable energy, strategic resources, and it wants to add value to these resources. Well, and Europe is interested in guaranteeing technology transfer, which is very important, and having funds to achieve this end, as was mentioned by Mr. Borrell in his last visit to Argentina 2 weeks ago, for example.
Well, let's have a look at what the two different sides gain out of this particular deal. Firstly, the European Union is already Latin America's third biggest trading partner. More importantly, geopolitical rival China is currently the largest trading partner with Latin America. The entire region holds a range of critical minerals, such as lithium, copper. In fact, as far as lithium goes, Chile and Argentina and one of the other countries in Latin America comprise around 60% of the world's known reserves. So is this simply, if you like, a neo-colonialism for the sake of getting hold of commodities? If I can put that across to you, Audrey.
Yes, I think especially civil society organizations in the region regard this deal as a neo-colonial trade deal. Just to go back with reference to sharing values with like-minded countries in the region, this deal was concluded in 2019 under the Bolsonaro government, who openly said that he would open the Amazon for mining and logging and agribusiness. And while deforestation rates and forest fires were increasing dramatically in the region. So under these circumstances, the European Commission concluded this deal. And it was also strongly met with strong opposition from civil society, but also decision makers in Europe.
Is that not a little unfair as a charge, though, at this time, given that he's lost the election and he's no longer there? You have a new president who is from a left-leaning political party, Lula da Silva, in Brazil. Even if we had those concerns at the point of the signing of the deal, are those concerns still valid now, in your opinion?
They're still valid because, as you know, Lula won at a very small margin. Again, civil society is, of course, very relieved that Lula has won, also because they've been criminalized under the Bolsonaro government. But Lula won at a very small margin, and Bolsonarism and the agribusiness linked to very conservative agribusiness bloc in the parliament are still very, very dominant in the parliament, but also at regional level. So it will be very hard to put in place all the damage that has been done under the Bolsonaro government, the dismantlement of indigenous institutions, but also environmental institutions. And again, like I said, this deal will consolidate an agribusiness model that is very damaging for climate, for human rights, and for the environment there.
Miriam, I'm sure that you have some views on that yourself. What are your feelings about the fact that this deal was signed under the previous Bolsonaro administration, but of course there has been the change? However, as we look across Latin America, there are various different political regimes across the continent, some of whom have a less than stellar record with regards to environmentalism and looking after the needs of the entirety of their populations.
Well, first of all, let me clarify, the agreement has not been signed yet. It has been concluded, but we have still not finalized it. And that's why I was insisting before that we are engaging in this process of addressing the sustainability concerns, the very valid concerns that have been expressed, and making sure that we have an additional instrument where we can really have the guarantees that there will not be any negative impacts in terms of deforestation, environment, sustainability, etc. Then another important element is that this agreement is with Mercosur. It's not just with Brazil, it's with 4 countries. And both 4 countries had negotiators that engaged with us for a long time. And we had an agreement which is the result of this bilateral negotiation. It's not the European Union coming with its own position and asking the third countries to agree to our position. We really enter into a negotiation process where both sides, not only Brazil, but the 4 Mercosur countries and the European Union have to agree with the final outcome. And then another important element is that we believe that the agreement provides a platform to further engage with the Mercosur countries. Without an agreement, we have no way to discuss these issues or to address the concerns. So we are better off with an agreement, with a strong agreement, where we can really discuss openly all the issues than without any agreement at all.
If we were to look at the period from 2000 through until 2020, 2021, which is about as far as we have decent, reliable data for, and look at Chinese state investment in Latin America, it grew 26-fold over the course of that period. Currently stands, I think, for the 2020 year, it is just slightly over $17 billion in that single year alone into Latin America. That's the entire size of the economy of Malta. Can the European Union really compete with that in terms of being a friend to Latin America?
The European Union is the largest investor in Latin America, so that's already a very important factor to take into account. At the same time, when our investors go to Latin America, they have to respect also certain principles. We have legislation in Europe, and even outward investment has to comply with this legislation. So that's also a very important factor that maybe other partners like China do not have such requirements and they can do things in a different manner. So we are very confident that we can introduce positive changes in the region through our investment.
Sandra, if I could bring you in here, how do you feel about this? If you like, the rivalry that there is between different powerful regions in the world. We haven't even mentioned the United States yet, all of whom look towards South America and they see a potential ally, they see a potential market. What does this mean for Latin America? Is it in their interests? Is it not in their interests?
Well, there are many interests that are these important global actors considering in Latin America. And I think, especially with the relations with the European Union, there are many opportunities of cooperation in setting international standards and moving towards another kind of agreements, which are not the business as usual or the business FTAs as usual. For example, with the Mercosur agreement, there can be this can be a role model and a way of disseminating norms that are up to the challenges of today. So the relation should be an example of sustainable trade regulations and a model for sustainable development. So the cooperation between these two blocs offers chances to put environmental and social concerns as a priority. And we can say, for example, that China has been there for a long time in the Latin American region. It is already the first commercial partner for countries, important countries like Brazil or Argentina. And they will not go out. So if Latin American countries don't sign, for example, the agreement with the Mercosur, they will not stop selling meat either to US or to Europe, but China will be there. And the patterns of trade with China have shown that the increase of agricultural exports to this country, to China, have weakened the national industries in Latin American countries. And this has led to the reprimarization of the economies in Latin America. So
let me cross to Miriam here, because there are some issues that I really want to bring in. Miriam, your specialism is trade and agriculture. So if I can focus on the agriculture side of that for the moment, one of the bases of the European Union was the common agricultural policy. We're already seeing a great deal of pressure on European farmers. There are protests going on in the Netherlands, for instance, with regards to the European Union attempting to clamp down on uses of pesticides, uses of fertilizer, other different aspects of the farming process. South America exports agricultural goods. Is the European Union not simply making a rod for its own back here by signing a deal with an area that exports agricultural goods?
Well, I think one of the biggest successes of the European agriculture sector is the fact that we are one of the largest exporters of food products. So we don't want to change that.
Is that to the benefit of either side then?
It is to the benefit from both sides because it's complementary. I do not think that we are necessarily competing. And what we do in our FTAs when we have, of course, sensitivities in the agriculture sector is that we take into account historical trade and we open quotas. So we let the products come in within a quota, duty-free, and then outside the quota, the products would be still subject to tariffs. And that is a way where we can defend the interests of our all farmers domestically, while at the same time also allow the third country to have access, preferential access to the European market. So we always find this balance to make sure there are no market distortions, but at the same time satisfying the offensive interest, the very legitimate offensive interest from our trade partners. And this is exactly the same that we have done with Mercosur. We also have our own sanitary and phytosanitary requirements that do not change with the agreement. So any product that is placed on the EU market, be it imported product or product produced in the EU, they have to comply with exactly the same standards. So that puts everybody on the same level playing field. Domestic production or import from third countries, and that also guarantees the food safety within the European Union, which is a very important element.
You mentioned their food safety and the standards. If we would look at, in particular, the Argentinian situation and also the Brazilian situation, soybeans that are grown in Brazil, on average, tend to be genetically modified soybeans, which is something the European Union has a bugbear about. Regardless of debating whether that is a correct position or not for the European Union to have, is it not going to be very difficult for them to police the genetically modified food that is grown in Brazil, Argentina, other parts of that region, and whether or not those adulterates slip into exports that come across into the European Union?
So products will be able to be placed on the European market according to the European rules. If they respect the European rules, if they are approved, they will be able to export. Those products that are complying with these high standards that we apply in the European Union market, they will still be able. And there are cases where they are able, of course. So it's not preventing the exports, and the Mercosur agreement doesn't change anything because the rules apply for everybody.
Audrey, you've been looking very skeptical there. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I want to just address two issues with regards to the sustainability of this deal. It was earlier mentioned that we have a strong trade and sustainability chapter. There has been legal studies that actually show the contrary, and that this trade and sustainability chapter has many shortcomings. For instance, it does not include human rights. It has very weak enforcement mechanism, which would make it hard to hold parties accountable for breaches if commitments are not completed. So it cannot guarantee sustainability of this agreement. And these legal studies also say that if this agreement should comply with sustainability standard, then environment, human rights, and climate should be at the core of this agreement and not sidelined in a chapter. It should be in all trade provisions. And that's the same thing with the additional annex that the Commission is now working on, trying to win over critical governments. It's merely a greenwash of this trade deal, because an additional annex will not address the fundamental issues that with regards to the environment, human rights, and climate, and will not solve the fundamental problems related to this deal.
Audrey, thank you very much for your time there. That's Audrey Shangu, Miriam Garcia-Ferrer, and Sandra Zapata. It's been a pleasure talking to all of you. Thank you very much for your time today. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and all of the team here, goodbye. And thank you for watching.